Russian President Vladimir Putin has reiterated his assertion that the 2022 invasion of Ukraine was a direct consequence of a Western-backed coup in Kyiv, a narrative consistently pushed by the Kremlin since the conflict's inception. This perspective frames the conflict not as an unprovoked act of aggression by Russia, but as a defensive measure responding to what Moscow views as an existential threat emanating from the expansion of NATO and the perceived subversion of a democratically elected government in Ukraine. The Russian government maintains that the events of 2014, which saw the ousting of then-President Viktor Yanukovych, were orchestrated by external powers to install a pro-Western government hostile to Russian interests. This interpretation fundamentally differs from the widely accepted view in Western capitals and by international organizations which characterize the 2014 events as a popular uprising against corruption and a rejection of closer ties with Russia in favor of European integration. Putin's argument frequently centers on the idea that the West, particularly the United States and its European allies, has systematically undermined Russia's security through NATO enlargement. He contends that the alliance's eastward expansion, contrary to alleged assurance given after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has brought military infrastructure ever closer to Russia's border, creating an intolerable security dilemma for Moscow. From this vantage point, Ukraine's aspirations for closer integration with NATO and the European Union are seen not as expression of national sovereignty, but as moves manipulated by Western powers to further encircle and weaken Russia. The Kremlin views the presence of NATO-aligned countries bordering Russia as a direct threat, necessitating a strong response to safeguard its own strategic interests and national security. This perspective often dismisses the sovereign right of nations to choose their own alliance and foreign policy orientation, framing such choice as proxies for Western influence rather than independent decisions. The Russian leader has consistently accused Western nations of actively fueling the conflict in Ukraine through the provision of military aid, intelligence sharing, and financial assistance to Kyiv. He argues that such actions prolong the hostilities, escalate tensions, and transform Ukraine into a proxy battleground for a larger geopolitical confrontation between Russia and the West. According to this narrative, the West is not merely supporting Ukraine's defense, but is intentionally working to inflict strategic defeat on Russia, aiming to undermine its global standing and internal stability. This accusation extends to claims that Western sanctions imposed in response to the invasion are an attempt to cripple the Russian economy and provoke internal dissent, rather than a legitimate punitive measure against international law violations. The Kremlin portrays these measures as part of a broader, long-term strategy by the West to contain and diminish Russian power on the world stage. Furthermore, Putin has frequently invoked historical grievance and a sense of betrayal by the West, particularly regarding the post-Cold War international order. He argues that the unipolar moment following the dissolution of the Soviet Union led to a disregard for Russia's legitimate security concerns and a unilateral imposition of Western norms and values. This, in his view, fostered a climate of resentment and laid the groundwork for future conflicts. The Russian government highlights instances where it believes its interests were ignored or dismissed by Western powers, contributing to a perception that Russia has been unfairly targeted and marginalized. This historical framing reinforced the idea that Russia's actions in Ukraine are a necessary assertion of its sovereignty and a pushback against a perceived hegemonic international system dominated by the United States. The narrative also incorporates the claim that the current Ukrainian government, which came to power after the 2014 events, is illegitimate and controlled by neo-Nazis and radicals. This characterization, despite being widely refuted by international observers and fact-checkers, served to demonize the Kyiv's leadership and justify Russia's military intervention as a mission to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. The Kremlin alleged that the Ukrainian government has systematically oppressed Russian-speaking populations and committed atrocity against them, necessitating a protective intervention by Moscow. This particular accusation is a cornerstone of the Russian propaganda effort, designed to garner domestic support for the war and to delegitimize Ukraine's sovereign government in the eyes of the international community, albeit with limited success outside of Russia's immediate sphere of influence. The accusation that the West triggered the conflict goes beyond merely arming Ukraine or supporting its government. It suggests a deliberate, long-term strategy of provocation designed to instigate a response from Russia. This includes arguments about the promotion of color revolutions in post-Soviet states, which Moscow views as covert operations to install pro-Western regimes. The Kremlin points to events in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 as examples of this alleged pattern of interference, claiming that these actions directly threaten Russia's strategic backyard and force its hand. This perspective implies that Russia is reacting to a pre-existing aggressive posture from the West rather than initiating aggression itself, fundamentally shifting the blame for the conflict's origins away from Moscow. In this context, the ongoing supply of advanced weaponry by Western nations to Ukraine is consistently presented by Russian officials as an escalation of the conflict and a direct challenge to Russian security. Statements from figures within the Russian government, including President Putin, often warned that such delivery increased the risk of a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, portraying the West as recklessly pushing the world towards a broader war. The provision of systems like long-range artillery, tanks, and fighter jets is interpreted not as defensive aid, but as offensive capabilities designed to inflict maximum damage on Russia and its forces. This framing aims to deter further Western assistance and to foster a perception that the West is actively prolonging and expanding the scope of the conflict. The Kremlin's narrative also seeks to draw parallels between the current situation and historical instance of Western intervention or perceived aggression. This historical revisionism aims to legitimize Russia's action by placing them within a broader context of defending against perceived Western encroachment. For instance, some Russian commentators have compared the current conflicts to the Cold War, suggesting a renewed ideological struggles where Russia is once again fending off attempts by the West to impose its will. This deep-seated sense of historical grievance and perceived encirclement forms a crucial emotional and intellectual underpinning for the Russian government's justification of its action in Ukraine, appealing to nationalistic sentiments and a narrative of resilience against external pressures. From the Russian viewpoint, the crisis is not solely about Ukraine's territorial integrity, but about the future of global power dynamics and the principle of a multipolar world. Putin and other Russian officials have repeatedly called for a new international security architecture that would acknowledge Russia's sphere of influence and prevent further NATO expansion. They argue that the current unipolar system, dominated by the United States, is unsustainable and inherently destabilizing, leading to conflicts like the one in Ukraine. This broader geopolitical vision frames the conflict as a struggle for a more equitable and balanced global order, where Russia plays a significant role as a great power rather than being subservient to Western dictates. The Russian government's communication strategy is largely aimed at a domestic audience, where state-controlled media consistently reinforce these narratives. This has been effective in shaping public opinion within Russia, where a significant portion of the population believes that the war is a necessary defensive measure against Western aggression and a legitimate response to the alleged mistreatment of Russian speakers in Ukraine. The relentless repetition of these themes through various media channels ensure that the official Kremlin line becomes the dominant interpretation of events for many Russian citizens, further solidifying support for President Putin's policies and action, even in the face of international condemnation and economic sanctions. The long-term implications of this narrative are significant. It entrenches a view of the West as an adversary and justifies a more assertive and confrontational foreign policy from Moscow. It also makes de-escalation and a diplomatic resolution to the conflict considerably more challenging, as it removes any sense of Russian culpability and place the entire blames on external actors. As long as this perspective remains the official stance of the Kremlin, the prospects for a fundamental shift in Russia's approach to Ukraine and its relations with Western powers appear dim, ensuring continued geopolitical tensions and a prolonged period of instability in the region and beyond. That's all for me for today. If you like the video presentation and you would like to follow for more, hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build this show for you. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. I will see you soon. Bye for now.